Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the second part of our Franco-German Forum on Energy Transition. I hope that you enjoyed your lunch break. It is the 8th edition, and I would also like to recall that the 22nd of January is a very special date. It was the date upon which the Élysée Treaty was signed back in 1963, and 20 years ago, also, this German Franco Office for the energy transition was initiated. We are also joined and supported by the Federal Ministry for the Economy and Energy and the French French Ministry for Finances, Industrial Sovereignty and Energy, Digital Economy, and then we're also supported by the Federal Foreign Office. I'd just like to add a couple of housekeeping aspects. I'd like to thank our interpreters, Sebastian Weitmeier, Nathalie Pigelet, Simone Hess, Alexander Schmidt, Helen Ferguson, and Kate Vanovich. And I would like to enjoin all of our participants to speak as slowly and distinctly as possible in order to help them in their work. And of course, you can always ask your questions in the chat that I would then transmit to our speakers. We will start with the first part of this second chapter. We will speak about the economic and environmental costs of the dependence in fossil fuels, a cost comparison between not doing anything and decarbonizing. We will also see that the cost for inaction could actually come in at 15% of the world gross domestic product in 2050. And obviously, we will not be able to go into every detail there, but we would like to welcome Mr. Kingsmill Bond. Welcome. You are representing Amber here, that I'd like to introduce you. You've worked for 20 years as an analyst in financial markets in London, Moscow, and Hong Kong for Deutsche Bank. You've also been analyst for Carbon Tracker and the Rocky Mountains Institute, and right now you're also analyst and director at the think tank Amber. And since January 2025, you have participated on the IRENA report on geopolitics of energy transition, and I'd like to hand you the floor for 20 minutes so that you can draw up the picture and lay out the state of affairs, so that afterwards we will then have an opportunity to ask questions. So please, to the audience, do put your questions into the chat. And Mr. Bond, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madame Croiset. Yes, I'm Kingsmill Bond. I'm a global energy strategist at the think tank Ember. I have a background, as you said, as a financial market strategist, and Ember's mission is to speed up the energy transition through data. I also happen to be an Irish citizen, so I have a strong incentive for my friends in France and Germany to succeed. So I want to start, if I may, before I plunge into the presentation, by saying that I have been a little bit shocked at the lack of urgency in some of the presentations I have heard today. And there are three numbers that everyone on this call should have at their fingertips and worry about in the age of Putin and Trump. The first number is that Europe imports nearly 60% of our primary energy. 60%. We are naked in a world of predatory actors. The second number is that our electrification rate in Europe is only 22%. It's been flat for 10 years. And that's why we import so much oil and gas. And the third number is that the European electricity price is more than twice the price of that in the United States or China. So we're in desperate trouble. And I have a presentation that answers this question, but it also sets out some of the solutions. There are four parts. I'm going to set the scene and argue that there's a technology shift going on in energy. Then I'm going to talk about how Europe is positioned for this shift. Europe's very badly positioned for the fossil system, but actually quite well positioned for the shift to an electrotech world. Then I'm going to talk about what Europe's done successfully and what we need to do, and then conclude by answering really the question, what are the benefits? The benefits of sovereignty, growth, the industries of the future, and lower carbon at lower cost than the fossil fuel system. Next slide, please. So To set the scene, we live in a world where the primary energy supply system is totally dominated by fossil fuels. Most global fossil fuel exports are from the 5% of people living in petrostates like Qatar and Russia. They generate rents of $2,000 billion every year for the lucky owners of the fossil fuels. And that's petrostates like Russia that invade their neighbors, and temporary petrostates like Trump's America that attack their former friends. Next slide, please. But the world, ladies and gentlemen, is changing very quickly. There is a technology revolution taking place in energy. The price of solar and batteries, for example, has fallen by over 99% since 1980. And electrotech solutions like solar or electric vehicles can now beat fossil fuels on price in a rising share of countries and sectors. And that's unlocked a renewable resource of solar and wind 100 times larger than the fossil fuel system. Next slide, please. This in turn has led to spectacular growth in what we call electrotech, that is the supply, demand and connections of electrons. Solar deployment doubles every 3 years, and in the first 9 months of 2025, for the first time ever, solar and wind were all of the growth in global electricity demand. Meanwhile, EV sales are growing up a standard S-curve and are speeding up global electrification. In 2024, electricity was nearly 60% of the growth in final energy demand and all of the growth in useful work demand. There are all then these new technologies connecting supply and demand, battery storage, HVDC lines, AI, demand-side management, and so on and so forth. And this is leading to peaking fossil fuel demand. So in Europe and the United States, we saw peak fossil demand in 2007. In China, it was probably 2024. And that means global fossil fuel demand is on a plateau and will be in decline clearly by the end of this decade. Next slide, please. And this technology shift, to be clear, is taking place across two vectors. We're decarbonizing electricity with solar and wind, and we are electrifying end demand with electricity, which over time gets cheaper, cleaner, and more abundant. Two vectors, by the way. A lot of the conversations today have been about the first vector, which is electricity generation. Next slide, please. Looking forward, this story is going to continue to get better. Solar and battery costs will continue to fall on learning curves. Within a decade, solar electricity and battery costs will nearly halve in price again to $25 per megawatt hour and $50 per kilowatt hour batteries. These prices are low enough to solve most barriers to change, but they're not in the IEA models. They're not in most people's models. People are not aware of how quickly prices are falling. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. You need to go forward. Thank you. Okay, so change is going to continue along two vectors. Solar and wind will increase from around 20% of global electricity supply today to 50% by 2035. Electricity in turn will increase from around 22% of generation to around 30% by 2035. So change is happening. Next slide, please. And this is the decisive decade where all the big changes happen, where the companies building the new technologies rise to prominence, electrotech gets too cheap to resist, and fossil demand enters into terminal decline. And I should mention the French author, Monsieur Fressos, he has this thesis of more and more and more. It's simply incorrect, because superior new technologies always push out expensive old technologies. Look around you, folks. How many horses and carts do you see? How many Nokia phones? How many coal-fired power stations? Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the world. That's the energy world. That's what's going on. How does Europe fit into this world? So Europe is terribly poorly positioned for the fossil fuel system. We have only 1% of the world's oil, 2% of the world's gas, and the European Union has even less. The European Union imports, as I said, 58% of its primary energy as fossil fuels. France imports nearly half of its primary energy. That's in spite of the nuclear. And Germany imports nearly 70% of its primary energy. That's a level 3 times as high as what's been happening in China. So China's leaders, in their wisdom, have curtailed the dependence. Our leaders have failed to curtail the dependence. And now, as I said, we're in trouble. It's a level of dependency that is no longer sensible or sustainable in a world where the United States is pursuing aggressive petrostate policies. Next slide, please. However, Europe is very well positioned to embrace this new world of electrotech that is coming. Europe as a whole has 17 times as much renewable potential as total energy demand, meaning we can provide all of our own primary energy. There are some countries, notably Germany, where there's less than 10, it's harder, but for the region as a whole, we have enough renewables, provided we put the interconnectors in place. Over 80% of European electricity already comes from domestic resources. Europe is responsible for 23% of electrotech capital expenditure, and we have a host of leading electrotech companies, as some of the other speakers have talked about, from Octopus to Schneider, from Iberdrola to Siemens, from ABB to Nexan. So Europe is very well positioned for the electrotech world that's coming. Next slide, please. But there is a but. We're not yet building out on both vectors of change. We're growing renewables, but we're not electrifying end demand. And as a result, we have been overtaken by China. China 15 years ago had 15% electrification. Now they're 30%. They've leapfrogged us. They're growing at 10 percentage points every decade. And in 2023, to complete the leapfrog story, Southeast Asia overtook Europe in electrification. Next slide, please. So the third section, what do we need to do about all of this? Now, this is, of course, highly complex, and many other speakers have talked about it. But as we've heard today, we need to do lots of standard solutions. So we need to build grids, we need to source minerals, we need to speed up permitting, we need to build more interconnectors and so on. But I want to introduce some slightly less consensus ideas. First and foremost, we need to get out there and sell the story to the peoples of Europe. President Macron talks about growth, peace, and climate. We can also talk about cost, security, and jobs. The second thing we need to do is as I have said, we have to start electrifying our end demand. We're doing a great job in phase one, renewables, 70% in non-fossil solutions, and heading for 90%. But we are failing so far in stage two, phase two, to electrify. So we desperately need to electrify end demand. If we don't, we will merely swap subjugation to Russian imports for subjugation to American imports. Next slide, please. Okay, so lots of ideas about how to increase electrification, but there's one key point, above all. We have to get electricity prices lower. Europe pays more than twice as much for its electricity as do China and the United States. And how do you do it? That means lots of hard regulatory work to shift taxes from electricity to gas, to speed up deployment, to change pricing structures. It means it doesn't mean gold-plated grids, folks. It means less expensive grids and more focus on deploying cheaper solutions like batteries, flexibility, and grid-enhancing technologies. Next slide, please. The fourth thing that we need to do is we have to build up our electrotech expertise in Europe. And this is complex, like this slide. It means doing strategic deals with China, Korea, and Japan to improve our ability to make electrotech, especially batteries. It means supporting domestic electrotech champions, incorporating AI into our thinking, and deploying cheap batteries and software to speed up grid development. It means buying electrotech from China when it suits us and deploying it as fast as possible. We should not obsess about making everything. To be clear, there are 3 times as many jobs deploying and operating solar farms as there are in making solar equipment. Next slide, please. And then finally, and possibly in terms of solutions, possibly most controversially for this audience, we need to focus on successful technologies, folks. It's 2025. We know what works, we know what doesn't work. Successful technologies are more efficient, they have learning curves, and they make us more secure. And that means we need to focus into electrotech, not the highly inefficient, expensive, old solutions of the last decade, carbon capture, biomass, even, folks, green hydrogen. there may be a role, there may be a small role for those technologies one day, but at the moment, an excess focus on them is distracting us from what we really need to do. So it's a bit like you're sitting in Chamonix, you want to climb Mont Blanc, and at the moment, what we're trying to do is we're trying to climb Mont Blanc, and we've got our ice boots on and our ice axe and all of our equipment and some oxygen. We just can't do it. It's too heavy. So we have to focus on the most sensible solutions right now. Next slide, please. So what does it mean then? And now I will come back to conclude and answer the question, what does it mean to reinvent Europe as an electrostate? First and foremost, it means a massive and rapid reduction in our energy dependence. At the moment, we're spending 300 billion euros a year. We're pouring it out of Europe, giving it to our enemies in the petrostates. Within 15 years, we can get all of our electricity from domestic sources, and we can electrify half of our final demand. That would halve our dependence on fossil fuel imports. Next slide, please. Then, as Director General Jurgensen noted, Electrotech is different to fossil fuels. There is this fake fossil argument that of an equivalence of dependency on Chinese Electrotech versus buying fossil fuels from the petrostates, but they're not equivalent because Electrotech, folks, is a stock, not a flow. You buy it once and it lasts for 30 years. In contrast, you buy oil and gas every single day, burn it and buy it the next day. And the other key difference is that Europe cannot build oil reserves, but we can build Electrotech, and we can harvest our own sun and our own wind. Next slide, please. So embracing Electrotech will reduce the cost of energy. The way this question was set up is that, it seems to be that it's expensive. It's not expensive, folks. If we embrace Electrotech, it will be cheaper, because the difference between embracing Electrotech and business as usual is all rents to the fossil fuel producers. So in simple terms, we spend CapEx today on Electrotech to reduce the annual payments to the petrostates. Net, our energy costs fall. And that's why in this framing here, in the IEA framing above, the 2050 cost of energy to consumers in advanced economies like Europe under a change scenario like net zero is half the cost under the fossil fuel scenario called CPS. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. As the brilliant Laura Cozzi showed us, Electrotech is going to open up the industries of the future to European companies and European workers. Europe already employs more than 3 times as many people in clean energy as we do in fossil fuels. So that's 5.5 million versus 2 million, according to the IEA. We have almost no fossil fuels, and our machinery industries can pivot from fossil fuels to Electrotech. So this is our chance. It's the chance of our generation to put Europe onto a better technology path. Next slide, please. And then there is one final benefit from all this. When you build an electrostate, you can rapidly reduce your fossil fuel use and your emissions. So the first European community, which, as you say, we are celebrating today, was built on coal and steel. It was built on coal and steel in the 1950s. 70 years later, the world has changed. The European Union needs urgent reinvention as an electrostate. And that is why, my friends, from every angle, almost every angle, there's only one choice now available to us in Europe. For our independence, for our wealth, for our jobs, and for our climate, we must embrace Electrotech. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup à vous, Monsieur Kingsmill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kingsmill-Bond, for this presentation. We have a number of questions that have been put to us online, and obviously you're very, very enthusiastic about electrification, and you've laid it out, but how can you reduce the electricity price without actually damaging the economic model?
So there are many ways to reduce electricity prices, and we are not seizing all of these opportunities. So one of the first things we need to do is we need to stop pouring money into expensive, difficult solutions like hydrogen hubs and hydrogen networks and carbon capture, and in the UK at least expensive nuclear. So let's just not waste all the money on these expensive solutions. The second thing that we have to do is we have to, as many of the other speakers have said, we have to radically reshape the way that we have our permitting regimes to make it much, much easier to get all these technologies out there. The third thing we have to do is we absolutely have to retool all of our regulations to make it easier, more effective, and quicker to get smart meters in Germany, for example, famous impediment, to put up heat pumps without special regulatory impediments. And then we have to move taxes off electricity, which is going to save us, and onto gas, which is going to kill us. So, I mean, those are really three ideas, but there are plenty of other ideas. But the key point is that we have to focus on getting electricity prices down. And I don't see or feel that urgency from the other speakers.
Alors, c'est vrai que c'est un des points que vous avez souligné. Certains
This is true that this is one of the points that you underlined. Others are obviously also developing economic models, and that is why this is part also of the challenge. Obviously, we can understand that you cannot pursue all of the avenues at the same time, but can we actually really fully electrify? This question comes up time and again.
So the question about whether or not we can fully electrify is an absolutely fake question. It's a fake question because we're at 20%. Who cares if we could get to 70%, 80%, or 90%? Let's get to 40% first. And sorry, the reason I feel strongly about this is because in our zeal to solve the last 10% of the problem, we're failing to address the next 10%. So it's a bit like, well, go back to my Mont Blanc analogy. It's a bit like worrying about how to scramble the last 200 meters, but not get through the foothills. And so, and then the other question, to be less passionate about it, the other question is the share of energy which can be electrified is rising every single year because we are innovating. So the ceiling of the possible is rising. 20 years ago, we thought it was 25 years ago, we thought it was 25%. IEA was doing reports about a decade ago, 35%. Now the IEA is putting out reports where it's 50 or 60%. The Energy Transitions Commission thinks it could be 70 or 80%. Let's be clear. Every single innovation that's coming out of Europe and China and the United States is leading towards faster and wider electrification. So please don't focus on these fake questions. We have to solve the problems in front of us right now.
Et évidemment, il y a une dernière question qui est en lien et on en
And there's a last question that is linked up to that. If we want to electrify, and more electrification means more infrastructure, you need infrastructure development or changing of existing infrastructure. Isn't that a challenge that is simply too tall for us?
I'm insulted as a European at this question. I mean, for goodness sake, we built this infrastructure. We built the grids 100 years ago when we had no grids. And now all we have to do is make them a bit bigger. It's really not that difficult. And we have all these wonderful new technologies, these grid enhancing technologies, this software and this AI. And I shouldn't let this go without mentioning my friend Jonas Bergersen and his idea of an energy net. There's so many innovations that we are failing to deploy. So yes, of course, to answer the question, we are Europe. We can do this thing, and we have to.
Eh bien, merci beaucoup à vous, Monsieur Kingsmill-Bond, pour votre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kingsmill. Thank you for this enthusiasm regarding this topic. Amber is actually publishing its report today on energy in Europe, and we see that for the very first time, solar energy is exceeding the production of fossil fuel energy in Europe. So there are clear highlights there clear reasons to be optimistic. And I would now like to seize the opportunity to say that all of those slides, all of the presentations will be made available on the website of the Franco-German Office starting on the 6th of February. And we come now to demand management and flexibility that we've already touched upon this morning. So these systems and the flexibility represent technical challenges, but also real opportunities in order to enhance performance. And we will be speaking about this with Dr. Martin Iffert. Thank you for joining us. You're co-founder and Director General of Energy Pool. You've studied electroengineering in Aix-la-Chapelle, and you are also CEO. And in 2020, you founded Energy Pool together with Olivier Bou. So you have the floor for 20 minutes on the service system and management of demand and flexibility. And please, if you have any questions, put them in the chat.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I'm really pleased to have this chance to speak to you today, and I was very happy to take up the invitation to talk about system services, demand-side management and flexibility. I've got a presentation. Here it comes. And let's begin straight away. Of course, an exciting topic. If we look at the last 20, 30 years, decarbonization was mostly perceived as a carbon challenge. But actually, the real problem is the stability of the networks, given all this reconstruction that's going on and the renewal of the energy system. And it plays a big part, network stability, as part of this reconstruction effort. We're not seeing greater stability in the network, but we have to think about how to focus on the new challenges, especially compensating for the impacts in such a way that we can make commercial progress. So, next slide. There's a bit of background about me. Natalie just summed it up. So my story is I have 30 years of industrial experience, mostly in the aluminium industry. So I've had a great deal to do with energy, business, and electricity. I was CEO of Trimet, and I took over an aluminium smelter in France. I'll say something about that. And worked with Olivier Bou on Energy Pool, which has been around in France for a bit longer, but the joint venture was something we set up together. Next slide. This is a little summary of Energy Pool, the international perspective. We have 15 years of experience, over 8,000 assets that we've been operating or managed through our platforms, about 400 people working for us around the world, many of them in France at our original location in Chambéry. If we look at the jigsaw puzzle, which the energy transition has brought with it, from a German perspective above all, because we could say something about nuclear and France, I'll come on to that later, but the German perspective is that we have drawn a great deal on wind and sun. And we've already heard this morning that we've already achieved 10% of the target, so major achievements have been made. But the missing piece of the puzzle, I feel, is demand response, so that we can go about this meaningfully. And if we look to see how it's done and what contributions can be made and how we can help industry, what have we got in terms of system missions? And of course, there's been support schemes, for example, carbon compensation, or the changes in privileges, because in the past, the basic constant load for industry was privileged. That's also a form of subsidy. And then we're looking at other ways of helping industry, and the costs could amount to several billion and will grow further by 2030. If you look at what's being expected in return, we can see that flexibility is playing an increasingly important role. Whether we're talking about decarbonization or the quota of renewables, because otherwise it's difficult to achieve some of our targets. So it has played a big role, and I come from industry, and I know that we need these framework conditions, especially during a period of transformation. Support for industry is essential to ensure that industry remains competitive in the international arena. One of the biggest transformations that we're seeing is, of course, affecting the power systems. And if we bear in mind that a power system isn't normally designed for basic load, but to cope with peak loads. So the last kilowatt hour, if you like, to ensure that that can be delivered. So my hypothesis, we don't have a problem with energy, but we do have a problem with capacity. And to design that sensibly, we need to take a step back, and I'll talk a little bit about my experience with aluminium, because I think it's a good example. Let's go back to the mule, the donkey. Thank you. Aluminium is a raw material and an energy carrier, you might say. Through aluminium, we can stack and transport electricity from A to B, from the place where it's produced to the place where it's consumed. Theoretically, you can turn aluminium back into electricity, but I'm not going to go into that at the moment. Next slide. Which brings me on to the start of our history, the cradle of European aluminium industry in the Maurienne Valley in the French Alps. This is Saint-Jean-de-Maurienne, which Trimet took over at some point, and where I was CEO for 5 years of this aluminium smelter. And actually, I took this photo myself because I have a home in the French Alps. But in the early 20th century, there were 6 of these smelters. And it wasn't because there was such a need for aluminium, but because there was no other way to transport electricity. Now they still have 1 smelter in the region, and it's doing a good job. It doesn't only produce aluminium, it's also very flexible, as we shall see in a moment. Next slide. If we look at the food chain in energy, we see the huge differences in consumption. Next slide. The small smelters, that's the little goldfish here. Its earnings power is obviously right down the bottom of the scale there, in the sense of how much EBITDA it can earn per year per megawatt hour used. And you can compare it with a power station, maybe, earning perhaps 20, 30, 40 euros per megawatt hour. If I look on the right side, the big data centers, their value would be 100 times more, which shows that theoretically they can pay this amount of money for their electricity. So if I am competing with a player like that in my network, it's hard for me as an aluminium smelter if I can't offer something else in exchange. And that's what we'll be coming on to in a moment. Because in the early 2000s, in the noughties, when I was still a young electrolysis engineer, and I was thinking, okay, our electrolysis isn't flexible. If you want flexibility, of course, you lose a bit of efficiency. But I was working very much on how we could make aluminium more flexible. Because you're not going to get from 0 to 100%, but a major part of the production process can be more flexible. We made the decision not to play in a defensive way anymore. That would be if I want to keep my rebates, but not have to accept risk or restructure. So we're not playing to lose. You could adopt a different attitude and look ahead and think, what do I have to do in order to achieve this different mindset? And that's something I began to do very early with the aluminium smelters. And now I think this play to win strategy is much more widespread. So from shifting from the risk perspective to the opportunity perspective, how does that help us go about flexibilization? Let's look at this in more detail. When we look at the load duration curve in Germany over the year, we see basically that the last 20% of the load only occurs in about 20% of the hours a year has. If you look on the right-hand side, 100% load over 100% of the time, if you have 20% basic load in the German network all the time. But that is a historical perspective. If we look at the way things work today and the residual duration curve, this is the residual load over the year. If we remove the sun and wind from the load, we get the residual load duration curve. And then the ratio is 40 to 25, and that's going to increase, but we can already see that at least 20% of the peak only occurs in 20% of the hours. And if we look at the final 5% on the time axis, we're down to 20%. So the question is, why am I developing load and how do I approach my load management? It's extremely expensive if you set up all the power stations you need to be ready for that final hour. It makes more sense to talk about how flexibility can help to make all this not only cheaper, but more successful for industry. And we can certainly look to see what they've been doing in France. I've got to know both countries quite well. In Germany, where I have my roots and have spent a lot of my career, but I also spent a few years running this aluminium smelter in France. And for 5 years, I've been running this joint venture with my French co-founder. So I like to look beyond the garden fence. In Germany, we often hear that entrepreneurs look with envy at France and they say, oh, if I had the same supply chain, I wouldn't have to worry about flexibility or demand-side management. But that is so wrong. In France, they started looking much earlier at flexibility, and that's why there's so much more experience with it. That's why I brought this chart along, which shows what happens in the summer and winter profiles. And we can see that in summer, you've got 50 gigawatt feed, and in winter, an extra 50 gigawatts. And if you look at the nuclear capacity, which covers the summer peak, more or less, which makes sense because you've got high utilization rate. But that extra 50 in winter is something that has always been tackled with flexibilization. And so industry is often far more flexible in France than it is in Germany. A lot of energy-intensive industries only run their production in winter months or stop altogether maybe for 2 summer months, which makes the whole conditions much more favorable. You need to understand the peaks, and if you do, you can respond correctly. Flexibility is like an iceberg, and we often forget that we only see the tip of the iceberg, and most of it is actually underwater. That's fairly easy as an image. There's an easy attitude to flexibility if we're only going to look at the tip. But if we look deeper into the processes, and I've done this research to see how we can make the aluminium process more flexible, all of this is below water. And electrification, hybridization, and process become very important aspects. And we at Energy Pool have a lot of experts who understand these things. They come from industry. I come from aluminium, others come from steel, paper, chemicals, because it's absolutely essential to have this know-how in order to enable companies to recognize the potential and to manage it. Because for a company, for a business, when you're confronted with flexibility, you begin with a kind of spaghetti mindset, because there's so much you can do. You can invest in batteries, e-boilers, thermal storage. There are so many things you can do. But how do you move away from all these individual tools to create a symphony? For that, you need an expert, and that's something we do at Energy Pool. We create a digital twin for the factory, and as we have this in-house expertise, we're able to reflect this at a high level. And we supply the software that makes it possible for the behind-the-meter processes. In front of the meter, you've got a lot of solutions, but behind the meter, how do we run our systems? And that's something that we have specialized in and that we can implement. I just wanted to show briefly here, because very often you get a quick answer from businesses who say, I'm not really that flexible, and anyway, I've invested so much money in my capacity, so I have to achieve 100% utilization, otherwise I'll lose my money. Well, it's right, but if we look at it from the point of view of an economy, let's do a comparison. If I say a gas turbine cost me €1 million per megawatt of installed capacity, an aluminium smelter maybe €3 for, let's say, thermal energy, and cloud data center, well, it will depend on the efficiency, but let's say €10. You haven't got total clarity here. You might have a ratio of 1 to 10, but if you look at the number of hours concerned in the year, it maybe makes sense to consider an optimum balance. And this optimum balance is the tipping point. Okay, an aluminium smelter, if you look at it statically, might account for 33% of demand. But if we run that over time, we can see, at least in terms of capital, it makes considerable sense. And there are people in Europe who look at these things, but it's not only in Europe. I've worked with people in Canada, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, who are asking the same question, because they've also noticed that that final megawatt doesn't make much sense. Why build capacity to cope with that? It makes more sense to focus on the other aspects. We don't need 2 umbrellas if it rains. If we can work together on flexibility, then we should embrace flexibility with open arms. It is important, though, to facilitate it, to empower it. So if we look at aluminium smelters, for many years, we have this topic of interruptibility. There are balancing services now, there are balancing markets, and we've seen this. We've done a lot of research in batteries that can make this flexibility available. The next slide shows us what this looks like in reality. These are the 2 smelters in France. We did this in Germany for a while too. When we took over the one in Frankfurt, we took on that model and we developed it in France. And now France has leadership in flexibility, because the regulation offers far more possibilities, and we don't have the same constraints. We don't worry about privileging that continuous baseload. Which brings us basically to the final story. This is the Hinafuji Temple in Japan, another photograph I took, which brings the perspectives together. There's a joint venture between Energy Pool and a company in Japan. We've offered our services to Japan as well. And the Japanese CEO, his uncle, had been in this temple recently. And we can see that flexibility isn't just a German or European phenomenon. We need it across the world. And I hope that we can design a successful future together on that basis. Here, last slide. Thank you very much. Obviously, I'm available for questions. Thank you, Martin Iffert, for that very visual presentation. It's based on your experience, and it's interesting for us. We do have some questions from our audience, and I'm going to ask you one, which relates to the capacity mechanism that was announced by the German economy minister. It needs to be agnostic in terms of technology. Now, what role can the management of load play in that context? Well, the capacity market can be very important. It can play an important role in the design of flexibility, but I fear that the current thinking about supporting power stations, if I can draw a comparison, in 2015 I was CEO of the French smelter when the capacity market was introduced in France. It originally was there to strengthen EDF, basically, but it brought momentum with it. And that meant that the industry looked much more closely at flexibility. And that's really important in the design, that industry can participate and benefit from the regulation. And I would say that's essential and will play a key role in whether the capacity market will have a positive impact on innovation and flexibility or not. And we require the best possible design for the system. Another question, you showed that French companies have been playing an active part for a number of years in designing flexibility. Why do you think are the main reasons that is not so much the case in Germany? Is it because of regulation or the market or industrial experience? Is there a different mindset when it comes to flexibility? Let me put that crudely. I think in Germany we can look forward just as far, but this privileging of the constant fundamental load that we've had since 1902, which means that you have to be able to cater for that basic load in order to claim your 80–90% reduction, I think that acts as a brake. And it inhibits companies because it's so much more important for them to achieve that reduction than to boost flexibility, so that maybe they're not attempting to seek that optimum point. And there's a danger that you throw the baby out with the bathwater. So in France, it was very quickly established that companies could keep that privilege, but could also benefit from flexibility if it enhanced the grid. So I think there's a lot more pragmatism, which I believe would help. It doesn't help if a company endangers its own existence by losing that traditional privilege, but that forces it to have to produce electricity when it's expensive. We saw last winter that doesn't necessarily make sense. We need to maintain the business case and offer the flexibility. Thank you very much, Martin Ilford, for your presentation and for answering the questions from our participants. We're going to move on now by taking a dialogue, because we've been talking a lot about the networks, the systems. How can we develop them to ensure the security of supply in France and Germany? And we know that the geopolitical situation calls for resilience as well. There's been a recent agreement between Germany and France, which shows how important it is to harmonize the regulation, at least for finance, and make more mechanisms available for sustainable investment. Fortunately, we have Madame Vargot with us, who is chair of CRE in France, and we also have Klaus Müller from the German Network Agency. And so an exchange between the two of you. And let me just remind those who are listening online that they can put their questions on the chat, which I will ask at the end of this little dialogue. I'm going to pass the floor to you first. Then it's published a report in September of last year for the years up to 2030. What does it basically teach us, this report?
First of all, thank you very much. First of all, to the Franco-German Office for the energy transition, for co-organizing this event. And of course, I'm always delighted to see my friend and colleague, Emmanuel Vargon, because of course, Franco-German cooperation needs strong institutions, but it also needs people who push it ahead and believe in it. The Federal Network Agency publishes this report on a regular basis. We want to look at security of supply and see whether it's secured for the future as well in the European context too. We published the most recent report just a few months ago, and it points out the homework that needs to be done. It says that we can have security of supply in the future if we do a number of things. We need to focus on grid expansion. In the light of renewables, we need to look at flexibility, as we were just mentioning. Furthermore, there's another major challenge. How can we produce generation capacity? For around about 2 weeks now, we've been focusing on this. I believe that my minister addressed this morning, or the State Secretary did so, with the green light for nuclear power stations and capacity for nuclear facilities. That will be linked to a capacity market, which will become much more important over the next few years in a cross-border context, technology neutral. That essentially is what our report laid out. We did indeed touch upon that this morning, but it's good to recall that again. Ms. Vargon, as to the situation in France, France is currently developing its 10-year transmission grid development plan. How are you looking at the investment? How are you going to secure the requisite investments? To start off, good afternoon to everybody. I'm delighted to take part in this wonderful event organized by the Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition. It's delightful to meet my friend Klaus Müller as well. We work together in very close cooperation, the Bundesnetzagentur and the CRE, and also, of course, at the European level. To reply to your question, well, yes, RTE, the French TSO, filed a 15-year development program from now to 2040. It's very ambitious because this grid expansion plan is looking at 100 billion euro investment. So that's a significant sum. There's across the board corporate coordination on that, and the CRE, which I head, is going to have the role of approving the plan and making any requisite modifications to it. So there's a very significant sum of approximately 100 billion euros. What are we talking about? There's various different aspects. First of all, we're looking at renewing the grid. A grid ages, of course. It's true for energy networks. It's true for transport infrastructure as well. So it's very important to renew the material on a regular basis. We need to adapt to climate change. Sometimes it's colder, sometimes it's hotter. There are greater extremes of temperature, there are floods. The grid needs to be able to stand up to that. Furthermore, there are certain areas where the grid's not strong enough at present, doesn't have sufficient capacity. We need to boost that, and we need to have new scope for connections for both users of electricity and suppliers of electricity. Data centers, for example, are a new demand-side challenge. So with all of that, we need to come up with answers. In the light of all of that, the regulator plays a challenging role. We're there to raise questions to, do we need this level of investment? At what price? How do things look in terms of technological feasibility? That's very true, in particular when it comes to planning, to managing various projects in technical terms as well, to ensure that it can all be implemented. And we're also looking at ensuring that the material is European, which is very important for European competitiveness. So that's all part and parcel of the development programme for the next 15 years. So we've seen what's happening in France on that front. What about Germany when it comes to this great expansion plan for Germany? How are you going to secure the requisite investments? Our process is a 2-year one. So every 2 years, we put forward a scenario framework. We did that in April of last year, and then we have a grid development plan that's drawn up. That's the legislation is then adopted. The next legislation on this is being addressed in Parliament at present. That looks at subsequent measures for grid expansion. Roughly 2 years ago, the Federal Network Agency developed overall planning up to 2040. Of course, we'd have to do all of this in one fell swoop. There's a whole host of planning and permit and approval steps that need to be taken. But it's pretty much like Emmanuel just said for France. The situation is very similar in Germany. First of all, let me add that we face the challenge of thinking about everything in European terms. Our two countries are right at the heart of Europe. We need to have a sufficient number of interconnectors to our neighbouring countries. That's a crucial tenet. Secondly, perhaps even more important and challenging in Germany, in the distribution systems, we need to look more at digitalisation. There are certain aspects that I would say are challenges for us. This is all at the top of the agenda. We need to be moderate and pragmatic. That's the real yardstick for us. We're moving on to financing. Let's say a few words about the tariff framework as well when we're talking about financing. So, Ms. Vagon, could you tell us a little bit about the situation in France at present on this front? I think it's very important to note this, although I suppose everybody who's listening is aware of this. It's consumers who pay for the grids in their entirety. There's a tariff that's established by the CRE in France, and that's for use of the grid. There's OPEX and CAPEX costs, of course, and these need to be allocated between the various different consumers. So the consumers fund all of the costs. So every 4 years, we establish the price structure. What we do is to look at two strikingly different considerations. So we need to ensure there's sufficient funds available for investment to deal with all the challenges. We need to limit the costs for consumers. We're thinking about improving performance and quality of service. That's what's really at stake when we're looking at the tariff framework. August 2025 was the last time that we updated this. It takes quite a long time, a couple of years, until we've updated it. So we look at the one hand on the level of expenditure, and we look at the kind of incentives given to system operators, and we look at the general way in which the tariffs and sub-tariffs are structured. We focused quite a lot on investments and on the kind of incentives built into the system. But of course, we also need to ensure the system's flexible, as the last speaker said as well. We're dealing with congestion and trying to strike that. There's various different reserves that we may need to activate. So we try to strike a balance between investing in expanding the grid, but also ensuring that we've got flexibility so that if there is congestion, we're able to respond to that differently, not just through new investment. So that's all at stake in our tariff system. Mr. Miller, I see you nodding. So, of course, there's an overall reform underway on this front in Germany at present. Could you perhaps say a little bit about the knock-on effect of this on grid expansion? Yes, there's two aspects we're addressing here, two different chapters. One of those was concluded pretty much on time at the end of December last year, because we want to set up a new structure for the DSOs in Germany. We're cutting red tape, making sure there's a better fit for the energy transition and making investment in our distribution system more attractive. So we've concluded that. We focused to a large extent on cost efficiency. That's not something which makes you terribly popular in the sector because it's hard work to be cost efficient. Since December, we've been working on a similar incentive system for the transmission system operators, the TSOs. We want here to focus on the European approach here to simplify this as well. It's likely that the German energy system can be said to be rather complex in this context. And the second cluster of issues relates to general grid fees. A ruling from the ECJ on this has meant that we've decided to take a systematic approach in this context. And there are issues here that have cropped up again and again today. Are there geographic localization incentives to become more efficient? Generators, including renewables, haven't to date had to take the transmission costs that they give rise to into account. And we're looking at changing this in future to cut the system costs. We've got a lot of people who've put private funds into solar energy setups in Germany. Prosumers, but they're not part of the solidarity system. We want to change that as well. And there's also the idea of making the system more flexible. We want to encourage greater flexibility, and that's, of course, very important as well as the 19.2 regulation. Germany needs to become more flexible on that front. Let's move on now to look at another topic which is relevant, I'm sure, for both of you. Ms. Vagon, you talked about developing flexibilities. How do you ensure stability of the grid in France and in Germany? Could you tell us more about the current mechanisms? One thing is certain. We're in the process of a thoroughgoing transformation of our grids. We had grids that worked with fewer elements in it in the past. Things are changing in France as well. It used to be fairly stable. We had our nuclear power stations. There was some fluctuation over the course of the day, but everything was fairly steady. But now we have a whole host of generators, and they're involved in transmission and in distribution. The generation side of things is more intermittent, more volatile. So we're trying to strike the right balance across the board, across time. That's very important for system operators. We're looking at all of these huge variables in the system. We need to learn lessons from the blackout in Spain as well. That was just a few months ago. In the face of this, when you look at investment in infrastructure, that's helpful. But there's also various different generation systems that need to adjust how much electricity they're generating in the light of the transmission systems. There's also a question of demand-side management, which we're doing as well, particularly for large users, and there's specific rules to ensure that we're looking at a technology-neutral approach. All producers, all of those generating electricity, no matter what kind of approach they take, have the same rules to apply to them. We've got stricter rules now for renewable facilities. If anything above 10 megawatts, whether they're producing solar power or wind power, they have the same obligations to be able to control what they feed into the grid on the basis of what the system operators are looking for. We've also looked at improving the interface between system operators and generators to ensure that the rules are clear and are stuck to clear, to ensure there's as much wriggle room as possible to system operators. And subsequently, we'll come back to the next point. I think that the interconnections, I mean, France and Germany are interconnected. France is interconnected with a whole host of countries. They're a key part of stability because they make it possible to look for additional production or additional utilization as well as required. The systems are, of course, complex, but they're very useful when it comes to managing stability.
Oui, rebonjour à ceux qui nous suivaient. On est vraiment désolé. On a eu un problème technique qui a interrompu le streaming. Donc, évidemment, vous ne pouviez plus suivre nos échanges. Il a fallu rétablir tout ça. Mais normalement, c'est dans l'ordre. Les organisateurs s'excusent vraiment. Et on s'excuse aussi auprès de nos deux intervenants. Nous sommes donc avec la présidente de la CRE, la Commission de régulation.
We apologize especially to our two speakers. We're just talking to the president of the French Energy Regulation Agency, Emmanuel Valgon, and the president of the German Network Agency, Klaus Müller. We're just going to finish off our session because we hadn't quite got there. Mr. Müller, I'm going to ask you a question still about the stability of the German networks. What mechanisms do you have already, and how do you feel about flexibility? Where have you got to? Yes, thank you. And just to keep it brief, the first thing is, of course, we observed the blackout in Spain, and I'm sure all our colleagues in Europe did, and asked, what does that mean for stability in Germany? Let me break that down into 3 points. One is, we were just talking about grid expansion, cross-border grid expansion, and the capacities under the 70% rule. Maintaining that is very important. And secondly, it's important to us that in our energy generation, we don't only think about the capacity that we need, but also about the downtimes, the other things that can occur. All of that is increasingly relevant because we have a growing proportion of renewables. And then flexibility would be the third very important thing. That affects private households, industry, where we want to make flexibility easier, and also the large batteries. We have a fantastic technological development in terms of prices, and it's one of the tasks of the Federal Network Agency to establish a regulatory framework that makes that easier so that battery storage has a business case, but we also need to ensure incentives. So you were talking about the 70%, and we're going to finish this dialogue by looking at interconnections. Perhaps Madame Valgon can talk about, we're talking about the 70% of operation, making that available through the interconnections for cross-border exchange. But you can explain it better than I can. And can we hear your view on what's at stake here and what role these cross-border flows play in energy security? Yes, of course, it's an important rule. Once an interconnector is available, the European rules say that 70% of the interconnected energy needs to be available for cross-border exchange. It's a result that we have been monitoring very closely. The systems operators, every respect to them, they're fully on the job. And if we look at the tariffs that we've been applying the last 2 years, we've included a financial incentive for RTE so that they are rewarded when they respect this rule and they pay a penalty if they don't. It's a difficult one to respect because we have a lot of flows with where there is congestion which can interfere. We have some loops, and sometimes the market order needs to go from one point in France to another point in France, but through German territory or vice versa. It's a bit of a challenge. There's quite a lot of work still to be done to see how we can respect the rule the best way possible and how much how much leeway is there for interpretation. And of course, it needs to be made available. Perhaps a comment on this from Mr. Müller. Yes, well, this is a strong connection between France and Germany. We're both at the heart of Europe, and that's why the link is particularly important to us. I don't want to hide the fact that in recent years and decades, Germany has a bit of catching up to do on grid expansion. I think we have a bit of a bad conscience about this, but we have made a lot of progress because we've had legislation to speed the process up. And perhaps there's a bit of a new mindset as well, understanding that Germany needs to do its homework. We are doing that now, and we're focusing. Thank you to both of you for your participation in this dialogue. And I'm terribly sorry once again that we wasted time due to the technical hitch. I do understand that you both have a lot of pressure in your diaries, and I'm sorry that there was this delay. But we're going to stop the dialogue there. We had a lot of exchange on this topic of the networks, which is key. We're going to take another break here so that we can now verify that really everything is working. So there is a break now, and we'll come back with a panel on how to ensure resource adequacy, which will address industry capacities, grid financing, and refinancing. That will be at 3:45.